Think of oil, natural gas, iron, nickel, and the countless other resources from the bowels of the earth. When one goes about buying commodities, you will notice one seemingly moot point. All of them, every single resource, is priced mainly in US dollars on global markets, not euros, Japanese yen, British pounds, Chinese yuan, the list could go on. The US dollar has this privilege because it is the world's reserve currency, a status which gives Washington D.C. immense influence over geopolitics and economics the world over. As it is the world's reserve currency, the dollar is a convenient, potent weapon for Washington, a weapon used in the place of armed conflicts which politicians on Capitol Hill may have little appetite for in the short term. This all begs the question, however, how exactly did the US dollar emerge to become the world's reserve currency and present Washington an attractive weapon to use in the place of armed conflicts? The story of the dollar's ascent to primacy begins in the First World War, when the USA became a major creditor to and supplier of the Allied powers such as the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Japan and their respective colonies. As it sold vast sums of raw materials, guns and armaments to the Allied powers before eventually joining the war itself in 1917, all those countries had to purchase those American products in gold or US dollars, increasing the dollar's global influence by default. The importance of the dollar to global finance and trade was not just relegated to war commerce, however. The First World War forced many combatants to resort to unconventional ways to fund the truly biblical war effort. This was the first industrial-scale mass slaughter the world had ever seen after all. This meant that the major global currencies in that era were crippled, as governments hoarded gold and silver to fund the war effort, and then many of them suspended the gold standard for their respective currencies. They ramped up money printing to fund the war effort, no longer limited in how much currency they could simply print into existence, but a now dissolved gold standard. Unfortunately for the cash-starved belligerents of World War I, even these unorthodox, desperate measures could not bring enough funds in to sustain their war efforts. For instance, as a result of its extensive combat on the bloodied beaches of Gallipoli, the chlorine gas-filled battlefields of Belgium, or the icy choppy waters of the vast Atlantic Ocean, to name a few, Britain, the great imperial power, had to borrow on international markets in 1917 to cover the costs of its own vast war effort. London, having exhausted its other revenue sources, had to abandon any notion of fiscal responsibility. This was to be an all-in effort. Currencies began to endure rampant inflation. Prices quadrupled in Italy and tripled in France, for example. This contributed to instability in foreign currencies, making the US dollar the textbook definition of a safe haven. It was the only major currency left that could be trusted to act as a store of value and not suffer gargantuan war inflation by investors. As countless nations and empires at total war lined up for loans, the only creditor which could lend at substantial sums was the United States, and its loans were denominated in dollars, of course. Now, a sizable chunk of the Allied war effort was being effectively bankrolled by Washington, or more aptly, Wall Street too, and the British pound sterling was no longer king, even with the US dollar being poised to dethrone the British pound from its position as a then reserve currency, a position it had held since as early as the 19th century. It would still take another world war and its subsequent economic shock to make the reality of a dollarized world a done deal. The 1944 Bretton Woods Conference was the gathering of 730 delegates from all 44 allied nations in New Hampshire, USA. This conference made history as it came to formulate the new international monetary order, one which would establish the US dollar as the supreme currency, officially at least. During the industrialized mass murder of World War II, one which easily trumped that of World War I by killing 65 million people or even more, the USA sold vast sums of goods and armaments to the allied nations, collecting payment for them in gold or US dollars. Additionally, the USA strengthened its prime creditor status by lending eye-watering sums of money to fund the Allied war effort. The Bretton Woods system, as a new monetary order came to be known, effectively pegged all the world's currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was redeemable for its own value in gold. This is because the USA had practically amassed the entire world's gold supply as a result of selling so many goods and armaments in World War II, which was paid for by foreigners in gold. Often, those foreigners literally spent their entire gold reserves in buying US products. Countries needed a stable monetary system, in layman's terms, a currency and financial system, to stage an economic recovery after the earth-shattering World War. But since they had spent all their gold reserves buying up US goods and armaments, they had no more gold reserves left over to start a gold standard, a stable currency system at the time, for their own currencies. Here, Washington effectively stepped in and let the world borrow the US dollar and use it as an effective substitute for the gold standard, since no one else could effectively recreate a gold standard for themselves. This was all made possible because the US dollar itself maintained a gold standard, and the currency was still convertible to gold. Instead of gold bullion bars being the prime store value, US dollars became the prime store of value, and nations began to build up reserves of US dollars to engage in global trade and finance, a phenomenon which was to a great extent made possible by the global system created by the Americans to fight the Cold War, a topic that deserves its own video. Foreign central banks had to maintain a fixed exchange rate between their own currencies and the US dollar. In return, the USA would redeem all US dollars for their value in gold at any time from foreign holders of US dollars. The system worked remarkably well at providing a stable bedrock for rebuilding. For a while, Europe and Japan recovered from the war and became effectively economic powerhouses in their own right. Foreign markets opened up for US products and corporations, as well as enabling the formation of a strong anti-Soviet alliance network spanning the globe, ultimately serving Washington's Cold War interests. But it was not to last. By serving as the world's last link to the gold standard, foreign currencies having a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar and the dollar being convertible for its own value in gold, other countries took actions to ensure their own currency's value relative to the US dollar remained constant, to keep it in line with the Bretton Woods set value or exchange rate for their respective currency. In return, the US had to ensure that those countries could get gold in exchange for the number of US dollars their own currencies bought. Sadly for those nations, due to the demand for US Treasury bonds as a safe haven to store a nation or investor's dollar reserves, the escalating war in Vietnam, and US President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society welfare program meant that not only did the USA find it easy to borrow large sums of money in the first place, they now had a reason to be spending big too. Not funded by taxes, of course. Life on a credit card is the credo from here on out in Washington D.C. The Vietnam War, which by the mid-1960s had escalated to a full-blown war for the United States, was costing Washington dearly. A troop surge took place whereby between 1964, just after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and 1967, the number of US soldiers sent to the rice paddies and daunting jungles of Vietnam rose from a mere 23,300 soldiers to a staggering 500,000, the biggest conflict for the Americans since World War II. This did of course cost a fortune. The Vietnam War cost $168 billion or $1 trillion today when adjusted for inflation. That included $111 billion in military operations and $28.5 billion in aid to South Vietnamese forces. To add to this spending splurge, LBJ's welfare programs ranging from education, housing subsidies, healthcare provision and more were costing tens of billions of dollars. This was not all funded by higher US taxes either. In fact, taxes were cut for most income groups by the preceding JFK administration. Instead, it was the hard-working printers at the Federal Reserve which paid for it all, alongside high US borrowing of course. With more US dollars being printed or loaned into existence, foreign countries began to worry if the USA could genuinely keep its promise to give gold for the US dollars foreigners held at the agreed exchange rate of $35 for an ounce of gold. And they had good reason to be afraid. The size of US gold reserves were falling just as the number of US dollars in circulation worldwide was rising. In 1960, the USA held $19.4 billion in gold reserves, including $1.6 billion at the International Monetary Fund, an institution set up as part of Bretton Woods. That was enough to cover all US dollars held by foreigners who may wish to redeem their US dollars for gold, with the max total value of gold that could be claimed by foreigners standing then at $18.7 billion. As the US economy prospered in the post-war boom, Americans bought more imported goods and paid for them in US dollars. A large balance of payments deficit began to emerge. In short, the Americans spent more dollars on imports than they earned from exports, and this meant that the flood of dollars became a torrent on global markets. Washington soon had more dollars floating around than it could redeem for gold to foreigners. The very foundation and promise of the stable monetary system that enabled in part the post-war boom was now in real danger of collapsing entirely. Towards the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the USA was suffering from stagflation, a toxic combination of high inflation and anemic growth, or even worse, a recession. Americans witnessed the high growth of the 1950s and 1960s tumble and saw unemployment soaring to height after height, with inflation ranging as high as 6% in 1969 and the growing US balance of payments deficit which flooded the global markets with more and more dollars. The fixed exchange rate system was impossible to sustain without devaluing the dollar against gold and other currencies. $35 for an ounce of gold, the cornerstone of Bretton Woods, was under total siege. Foreign investors and central banks, sensing the USA could not keep on guaranteeing this conversion rate, rushed to exchange their US dollar holdings for US gold reserves before the USA devalued the dollar and made it so more dollars were needed for an ounce of gold, making them poorer in effect. As nations and investors from around the world looted Fort Knox's gold stash, Nixon moved to devalue the dollar with the Smithsonian Agreement, a last-ditch effort to salvage the now terminally ill Bretton Woods system. Nixon adjusted the rate to $38 for an ounce of gold, from the previous $35 for an ounce of gold. This only spooked more investors, and soon a tsunami of claims for US gold reserves came as more nations and investors rushed to convert the now rapidly devaluing US dollar stockpiles into actual gold reserves to take back with them. This was the final straw for the Bretton Woods system. The situation was untenable, and Nixon finally decided to act decisively, appearing on a television address which would shape our world even till this very day.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. In full cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and those who trade with us, we will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. Stability and equal treatment is in everybody's best interest. I am determined that the American dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators. I'm taking one further step to protect the dollar, to improve our balance of payments, and to increase jobs for Americans. As a temporary measure, I am today imposing an additional tax of 10% on goods imported into the United States. This is a better solution for international trade than direct controls on the amount of imports. This import tax is a temporary action. It isn't directed against any other country. It's an action to make certain that American products will not be at a disadvantage because of unfair exchange rates. When the unfair treatment is ended, the import tax will end as well.
Nixon's words in that television address killed the world of Bretton Woods. The last links between gold and the US dollar were cut, and surely the primacy of the US dollar and Washington's power over global financial markets would have ended with it too. Whilst Nixon killed the Bretton Woods monetary system, he did not kill the institutions and systems which accompanied its creation: the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and more. This is where a considerable amount of the US dollar's influence still comes from, besides the fact that everyone still uses US dollars for there being lack of an alternative. It is with this backdrop that Washington has increasingly, over the decades, exercised its most feared shadow weapon: sanctions. The US dollar remains the world's reserve currency due to many factors, some of them being America's advanced world-leading financial services and markets, making them a big customer for many exports, goods which are only paid for in US dollars, and the perceived stable nature of the dollar compared to other currencies, since it is backed by the powerful US government and the world's largest economy by GDP. Due to this, much of global commerce and finance going through US or European banks and other financial institutions, of course, all deal with US dollars. This fact alone provides Washington with great leverage over the rest of the world, but it doesn't end there. As it turns out, with globalization and increasing international business, it's pretty important for banks across the world to be able to transfer funds between clients who pay and those who earn from commerce and investments worldwide. If a nation or group of countries were to be cut off from the global financial network, it would be a declaration of economic war, since foreign investment would collapse, foreign trade between it and the rest of the world would become near impossible, and the nation or nations affected would be plunged into the depths of an unsavory economic disaster. It can be crippled because the information for international money transfers cannot be forwarded to its banks. When a country's banks are cut off, it can't pay for imports and can't receive payment for exports. The system which underpins global financial transfers and enables smooth flows of money across borders is called SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. The name may be mind-numbingly dull, but behind the facade lies a formidable economic weapon. War is expensive. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan have all cost Washington's purse eye-watering sums. Despite the war hawks that have been present in the US government for decades, presidents and congressmen and women all have to face elections, re-elections, and the unforgiving court of public opinion. Thus, American politicians' ability or willingness to simply whack every geostrategic adversary their nation faces with the hammer of $800 billion worth of US military power is limited to more serious threats. War is also disincentivized if the enemy in question is a major military power, let alone a nuclear one, since such a conflict will almost certainly cost much more than what most US voters are willing to put into some quote-unquote far-off distant land, which they have no connection to whatsoever. So what to do if such a distant power was threatening US geostrategic interests in a region or across many regions? Unless the enemy invades a country in a full-scale invasion, such as Kuwait in 1991, or attacks US forces directly, large-scale military action is unlikely to be Washington's response. Why waste bullets, the logic goes, when you can simply destroy their bank accounts and livelihoods at the stroke of a pen, probably somewhere from the White House? Life has surely gotten too easy for those hard-working strategists in Washington D.C. Sanctions offer an attractive solution of both achieving geopolitical aims and without the hefty costs associated with other methods, such as war or arming rebel or proxy groups, which from the American experience tend to be not so loyal, to fight against the designated enemy in a proxy war. For politicians facing re-election, there is no proverbial blood on their hands by sanctioning an enemy, as there would have been by showering a target with bullets and bombs, but the prize of getting a victory is just as great if your enemy succumbs to the pressure of sanctions. Thus, every administration since the 1960s has steadily deployed more and more sanctions in some form. But then the question arises, how exactly do you sanction? Despite headlines everywhere proclaiming new Iran sanctions or quote-unquote Russian sanctions renewed, the common guy on the street most likely has no clue as to what's going on in detail. Thus, let me enlighten you to the wonders of being made poor overnight thanks to a dude in the Oval Office signing a piece of paper. As aforementioned, since the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, many global financial transactions flow through US banks and financial institutions, which Washington can impose orders upon. Additionally, the euro is often dubbed the world's second reserve currency, since it accounts for around 25% of global foreign reserves, second only to the US dollar. Luckily for Washington, since the European Union, or more specifically its member states, often rely on American military power for a large part of their defense and on-market access to the United States for their economic well-being, it is easy to get them on board with Washington's sanctions. Remember SWIFT? Well, it can block nations from using its transfer system, crippling their economies, and the US, let alone its European allies, hold sway over whether or not that happens. The US Treasury can simply order American banks and financial institutions to not do any business with country X, already dealing a major blow to country X's economy and international trade by virtue of the US position as the world's largest economy. Next, the US Treasury can simply threaten to disconnect SWIFT from accessing US financial institutions, which are among the most powerful and largest in the world. Or the US Treasury could simply threaten to impose sanctions on the board of directors of SWIFT, which includes the executives from some of the world's largest banks, if they refuse to disconnect targeted financial institutions or nations blacklisted by Washington. Thus, SWIFT will always comply with major US sanctions campaigns as a matter of simple economics. Why lose your biggest customer and with it your importance? SWIFT then cuts off country X's financial institution's ability to use it to transfer funds globally. Consequently, at the stroke of a pen in the Oval Office, country X's economic fate is sealed. We don't have to imagine a country X to see how this might play out. All we have to do is look to Russia and Iran. For different reasons, Russia's being its invasion of Crimea and Iran's being the support for rebel proxy groups that oppose Washington's geopolitical objectives, as well as a nuclear weapons program which is frowned upon by Washington D.C. and Tel Aviv, these countries face US and international sanctions. The effects have been taxing for both. Economic development, usually achieved by countries exporting their products, natural resources and so forth, to high and middle income countries located in Europe or North America for example, as well as some East Asian nations, has become difficult for them since they cannot even transfer funds with the rest of the world, let alone sell to these major markets which have blacklisted them. It made them far more dependent on oil, and oil is of course sold in US dollars on global markets and relies on financial institutions which are linked to the USA in some way, shape or form, either by ownership or large business dealings. Countries not wanting to take the risk of being sanctioned themselves for violating the existing sanctions stopped buying Iranian oil, sending their economy tanking. Unemployment rose, inflation rose, government revenues fell, and instability became the new normal. Oil prices are by no means constant. Fluctuation is the name of the game on those markets, and the oil prices these days have been rock bottom. Russia had to burn through its foreign currency reserves in dollars and euros to pay for its increasing budget deficits, as the Russian government was making far less than what they made up for in revenues. And this is with the rising risk that it will have to plough into its national pensions fund to cover future deficits as the foreign currency reserves dry up, although Putin did raise the pension age by a few years to stave off the looming crisis, worsened by demographics regardless. Their respective currencies collapsed in value on forex markets, making imported goods expensive and worsening living standards even more. These trends have made the economic standing of Iran's and Russia's citizens suffer. Perhaps this is what Washington banks on to increase civil discontent and topple the regimes, if not force those nations to reconsider. However, it is not a quick solution. Sanctions can take years before the strongman leaders break and pull back from policies America dislikes. As citizens suffer, anti-American sentiments may weaken US soft power, and sometimes making those strongman leaders even more popular as a person to rally around in opposition to US sanctions and the ever-present bogeyman of US imperialism. Although sanctions are not a magic bullet to achieving US or Western geopolitical objectives by laying waste to major industries or sectors of the targeted nations by locking them out of crucial global financial and trade systems, it can deal a lot of damage. By inflicting heavy penalties for going against major geopolitical objectives of the United States, nations are often deterred from doing so and instead are forced to maintain cordial if not good relations with Washington to ensure their economic well-being is not compromised, lest they end up as the next Iran. As with anything, moderation is key. If Washington abuses sanctions too much, nations may very well be interested in creating an alternate global system that could threaten America's ability to use this potent weapon, regardless of how much effort such an undertaking may require. However, with the primacy of the US dollar, lack of a credible alternative for use globally, and an effective ability to enforce sanctions, this is unlikely to be a risk anytime soon. Dollar privilege also gives the Americans what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called the exorbitant privilege. That is, the ability to not only face a balance of payments crisis ever, since all trade is usually in US dollars, which they can just simply print to buy goods, it also allows Washington to borrow vast sums of money to spend on its vast military, or perhaps domestically to improve infrastructure, public services and so forth. In effect, the rest of the world in a way pays for America's high living standards and spending, since the dollar is the world's reserve currency. So the Federal Reserve and the US government can simply just print money or spend it into existence without worrying about the collapse of the currency, unless it is extreme printing or spending leading to hyperinflation. Since the world as a whole will need access to the dollar to trade, they all have a vested interest to keep the dollar afloat because its collapse would bring about a financial crisis on a biblical scale. America, by virtue of being the only country that can print dollars, benefits from the ability to borrow large sums of money which most other countries cannot even dream of, since the dollar is key to global finance and commerce. It also benefits from being able to cripple countries economically if they don't toe Washington's line in league with its other allies. From Bretton Woods till today, American policymakers have crafted an international system which gave the world much needed stability to rebuild from World War II, but it also granted Washington global power and reach without needing guns and bombs to achieve its aims. American geostrategic concerns are considered by leaders worldwide before deciding which policy to follow, lest they be destroyed by sanctions too. With the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system in 1971, it remains to be seen how much longer this state of affairs continues. For now, however, one can say the Americans got a hell of a bargain.